In June 2003, a man in a white van stopped to ask a young girl for directions to Mont de la Salle. To help the stranger, the girl got into the van to show him the way. The girl reported that once inside, the man's demeanor changed. He looked away and smiled, but it was an evil smile. He tied her hands and ankles with ropes before asking her if she was a virgin, and told her that if she was, he would rape her. While he was driving, the young girl was tied to the back of the van. She managed to cut the ropes and free herself, jumping out of the van at the next traffic light and escaping. The young girl managed to flag down a car that stopped to help her. They then drove in the same direction as the van, hoping to pass it, and they did. The driver wrote down the license plate number and immediately stopped at the nearest police station to report what had happened. Michel Fournier was a 62-year-old French forest ranger living in Sartcastin, a remote village of about 150 people, with his wife Monique Olivier and their young son. Fournier and Olivier met in February 1987 when Fournier was 45 and Olivier 38. They met while Fournier was in Fleury-Mérogis prison in France. While in prison, he placed an ad in a Catholic magazine called Le Pèlerin. The two exchanged over 200 letters over the course of 10 months, leading to Fournier asking Olivier to marry him. She agreed, but this was no fairy tale love story. Olivier had been corresponding with Fournier throughout those 10 months, knowing full well why he was in prison, which was for sexually abusing several young girls. Fournier even kept a diary with detailed descriptions of his victims and the attacks he committed against them. The letters between the pair contained dark and perverted conversations and revealed Fournier's obsession with virginity. Fournier claims to have had a vision of the Virgin Mary when he was 12 years old, and has since become fascinated with the idea of the Virgin. In the letters, Fournier refers to his victims and states that he wants to pierce the membrane with his penis, which he calls the rainbow. The letters contain a perverted sexual pact with Olivier, stating that she would find him a virgin, and he would kill her abusive ex-husband, which he never did. In October 1987, Michel Fournier was released from prison. Now let's move on to what happened after the police traced the license plate number. Police tracked the license plate number of the vehicle and identified the vehicle as belonging to Michel Fournier. On June 27, 2003, police began searching Fournier's home, using a combination of excavators and ground penetration techniques. In the home, police found children's clothing, condoms, masks, handcuffs, inhalation masks, pistols, and ski masks. When the police questioned Olivier about what they had found, she claimed to know nothing about these tools, and appeared to the officers as a submissive, clueless woman, always looking down at her shoes. Fournier refused to speak or cooperate with the police in any way while in custody, so they approached Olivier. Their first impressions were that she was probably the obedient wife of a wicked husband, who had fallen into their clutches. The police were desperate to uncover any evidence that could implicate Fournier in the disappearances of several young girls, fearing that his year-long detention would soon be over if they couldn't come up with anything. They endured excruciatingly long interviews with the quiet Olivier, who would merely nod or shake her head. Was she protecting Fournier? They couldn't say for sure, but after many interviews and intense pressure, Olivier finally began to open up, and within half an hour she had reported 6 murders to the police. But the full truth about her relationship with Fournier was darker than anyone could have imagined. It was this woman who helped him bring the victims home. It all started on December 11, 1987, 2 months after Fournier was released from prison, when they found their first victim, 17-year-old Isabelle Lavelle, and the duo began their evil plan. Fournier got out of the truck he was driving with Olivier to enable her to approach Isabelle as she was returning home from school, so that she could offer to drive her home. While driving, they passed Fournier, who pretended to be a passenger asking for help. Because they knew Isabelle would be reluctant to get into the truck if Fournier was around, and that she would feel safer with Olivier. However, Olivier forced Isabelle to take a sedative, Rohypnol, and they returned to their home. Fournier had planned to rape Isabelle but had difficulty getting an erection, so Olivier performed a sexual act on him to help him, and he was able to carry out his plan. Fournier then strangled Isabelle and disposed of her body in a disused well in Bussy-en-Auth. Isabelle's remains were discovered more than 18 years later, on July 11, 2006. On August 3, 1988, Fournier and Olivier drove to a supermarket in Chalons where they met 20-year-old Fabien Leroy. Feigning illness, Fournier and Olivier asked for her help in finding the nearest medical clinic. Fabien got into the pair's truck and drove them to a remote forest in Mormel-en-les-Grands where Fournier raped her, then shot her in the chest with a hunting rifle. Her body was found the following day. On 4 August 1988. Jean-Marie was invited to Fournier and Olivier's home after Fournier met her on a train to Charleville-Mézières while Jean-Marie was staying at a convent. The first time Jean-Marie visited their home, nothing happened, but the second time would lead to her murder. That night, Fournier began asking Jean-Marie about her sex life and whether she was a virgin. Clearly disturbed by these types of questions, Jean-Marie tried to leave the house. Fournier and Olivier attacked her, pinning her down and gagging her with duct tape before continuing to strangle and silence her. Jean-Marie's remains were discovered and a garbage bag containing a protruding bone was found in July 2004 at another property owned by the couple, a mansion in Donchery, and the next victim is Elizabeth Bridget. Elizabeth was 12 years old when she became Fournier and Olivier's next victim. Fournier saw her walking to a friend's house, followed her, lined up outside the house and waited for 3 hours for Elizabeth to come out. At this point, Fournier and Olivier were with their young son, who was born on September 9, 1988. Fournier and Olivier sat in their car for 3 hours with their baby, and used him to lure Elizabeth into their truck, saying their child was sick and if she could help them find a doctor. When Elizabeth got into the car, they drove her to their home where she was tied to a bed in one of the rooms. But when Fournier tried to assault her, he saw that she was menstruating and asked Olivier to intervene. Olivier washed the girl's genitals, and then raped her. The next day, Fournier took the young girl to their mansion and assaulted her again before strangling her to death. Elizabeth's body was found buried in a 3-meter deep hole in July 2004, still wearing the pink raincoat she had been wearing when she was kidnapped. The police wondered at the time how Fournier and Olivier had managed to buy a mansion that came with 15 hectares of land, given that Fournier's job at the time was simply a forestry worker. But the answer came from Jean-Pierre Helgoires, a bank robber who was part of the Baroques gang and who shared a cell with him before Fournier was released in October 1987. Helgoires had enlisted the help of his wife, Frida Hamish, to recover a large treasure buried in some woods, but unsure if she was up to the task, she called in the help of Fournier and Olivier, who had become close to Frida. The three managed to locate the treasure and recover several dozen kilograms of gold, coins, cash. But the details of what happened next are unclear, except for the revelation that Frida had been stabbed to death and had been stuffed into the trunk of a car, which they used to get to the place where the treasure was buried. Frida's body was never found. Fournier and Olivier blamed each other for the murder. Fournier took the treasure and bought his mansion for $1.2 million in cash. Fournier and Olivier were able to live off the rest of the money for 15 years. Now on to the next victim. In 1990, Joanna Bark, an English teacher and student from Newham-en-Severn in Gloucestershire, was working at a school in the Burgundy region of France and placed an advert in a local newspaper offering private English lessons. After receiving a response to her advert, Joanna met a man in a popular square in Auxerre who was looking for an English tutor for his son. The man was Michel Fournier. Fournier offered to drive her home, but when she got into his van, Fournier attacked her. Joanna was beaten, raped and then strangled to death, while Olivier sat in the front seat of the van. Fournier then threw her body into the River Huon. The next victim's name is Natasha. A 13-year-old girl was lured into the duo's van when they asked her for directions in November 1990. As she walked through a car park in Le Clairetasset, they drove Natasha to a remote area near the coast where Fournier stabbed her in the chest with a screwdriver before strangling her and leaving her body on the beach. Post-mortem examinations showed Natasha had been raped after she was killed. On May 17, 2000, a police officer reported his niece, Céline Sajan, missing, insisting that Céline was not a runaway. On July 22, 2000, her skeletal remains were discovered by a group of mushroom pickers. Fournier lured 18-year-old Céline Sajan into his truck as she was returning home from school on May 16, 2000. He drove her to Sartkesten, Gaden, Belgium, where Fournier and Olivier had moved in the early 1990s. Fournier raped Céline, then strangled her to death and dumped her body in a forest in Sani. And the next victim, Manania, also disappeared on May 5, 2001, when she left a library in Sedan, while her mother and stepfather had gone to do some shopping. When Manania did not return home that night, her mother knew something was up and began prowling the streets with her daughter's photo, asking if anyone had seen her. In March 2002, a climber found a skull and some clothes lying in a forest in Belgium. These were the remains of Manania. Fournier had seen her several weeks earlier and approached her one evening with an offer to go play with his young son. Fournier admitted to killing her but denied raping her. However, Olivier told police on July 1, 2004 that her husband had raped the terrified girl several times and didn't care. During her interrogation, Monique Olivier told police that Fournier had killed a 16-year-old girl who had been hired by the family as a nanny in their home. Olivier claimed that she saw Fournier enter the girl's room, then heard screaming and crying, and that she never saw the girl again. She also told police that she had written the advert for a nanny. Fournier is alleged to have killed the young girl in 1993, but this has never been confirmed, and the identity of the girl in question has never been established. The police would have undoubtedly wanted the maximum sentence for both Fournier and Olivier, but they knew that it would be more difficult to get that sentence for Olivier, who had only been involved in one of the crimes. The trial began in 2008 and turned into a media circus, due to the circumstances surrounding the case. Although Fournier was already a convicted rapist, the focus was on Olivier. How could she, as a mother and a woman, have helped her husband rape and murder several young girls over a decade? Olivier was known for playing the role of the obedient wife, terrified of her violent husband, who was forced to carry out his evil plans for fear that he would do to her what he did to so many of his victims. The police always maintained that she appeared to be a submissive, unintelligent, lazy wife, but not everyone was convinced. In 2005, psychologists tested Olivier to determine her level of intelligence. One test involved creating shapes from red and white blocks, with Olivier scoring 36 out of 40. The French average at the time was 11. Another test, known as codes, required her to memorize symbols and match them to a sequence of letters. Olivier scored 76, the French average at the time was 17. Monique Olivier had an IQ of 131, placing her in the top 2.2% of the French population. Olivier was no longer seen as the submissive, unintelligent wife of a creature, but instead was seen as a demon, and some even believed she was the mastermind behind the crimes. Michel Fournier became unbearable during the trial. He refused to answer any questions, and even held up a sign that read, "No closed session." Closed mouth. He refused to be photographed and also asked the female jurors to state whether they were virgins when they married, a request that was of course denied. On April 30, 2008, the trial brought up the sex lives of Fournier and Olivier. Fournier suffered from impotence and often needed to be aroused by Olivier before carrying out his sexual assaults. Olivier also admitted that they would reenact these scenarios in their sex lives, asking Fournier to rape her just as he had done with his victims. It was also revealed that Olivier was the one who physically checked whether the victims were still virgins. During the trial, during Olivier's defense, the victims' families left photos of the victims, along with a single white rose, and left the courtroom. The families stated that they did not want to hear anything that attempted to minimize or explain away Olivier's role in the crimes committed against their daughters. The defense was largely based on the fact that Olivier deserved a lighter sentence than Fournier because she was merely an accomplice, and that the only reason she was a mother was unfair since Fournier was also a father, but did not seem to receive as much hate as Olivier. Michel Fournier was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Monique Olivier was sentenced to 28 years in prison without parole. Now we move on to the last victim and then we go to trial. Estelle Mouzon disappeared on November 9, 2003, while she was walking home from school. Among the cases that authorities could not link to Fournier, the police learned that a man had already approached one of her colleagues and offered to drive her home because her bag looked heavy, but the young girl refused, stating that it was close to her home. They were able to obtain a sketch of the man in question, along with a description of the vehicle he was driving, a white van. The first suspect was Fournier, who was arrested in June 2003 in Belgium, but he had an alibi. On the night in question, he was on the phone with his son because it was his birthday, and phone records proved this call. However, Olivier stated that she was the one who made the call to Fournier. She also stated that she took care of Estelle when Fournier returned her to their home, even taking her to the bathroom. Estelle Mouzon's body was never found, who was 9 years old. Michel Fournier, who suffered from Alzheimer's and heart problems, died in prison at the age of 79 in 2010. Monique Olivier will be eligible to apply for parole in 2032, she will then be 82. Here we have reached the end of the story. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to like and subscribe.